snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hi guys! So I am here today to do a book review, and I'm going to be reviewing book number 5 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. This is by Steven Erikson and it's called Midnight Tides. This one was really great, so good, I loved it. It was the second one in a row that I've given 5 out of 5 stars to. It was awesome. And this one actually focuses on a whole entirely different part of the world. We are looking at a completely different section of the world that we haven't even come across before, but we do get to see some characters, only like 2 characters, who are in this story from past books. So we see a TISTE EDUR called TRULL, and it's basically kind of his backstory. So we've already seen him in previous books, and we've already seen what he's like now, but this book sort of focuses on his backstory and the events that led up to him coming into the other story that we've already seen him in. So I really enjoyed this. It was very well written. The story felt like it was one of the best structured ones so far. I just felt like I connected instantly with all of the characters and was really engrossed in this storyline. And I actually listened to this on audiobook whilst I was finishing up my final project for uni, and I read this in like 2 days, and it's a good 900 pages, so it's long. It's a long book, and I read it in 2 days, so I just absolutely ripped through this. It was so good, I loved it, and I was just listening to this non-stop while staying up super late for uni, so it was definitely great to get me through, and I really enjoyed it. So let's get into what this one's all about. Basically, some of the things that I really enjoyed about this one compared to all the others in the Malazan series so far, because this one was my all-time favourite so far of them, was that each and every character had their own individual storyline that felt really developed and really well conceived. It was certainly more cohesive than the other storylines that we've had in previous books. I feel like I understood the way that the 2 different tribes that we follow, their storylines were woven really easily. Even though we were following lots of characters again, unlike the book before where we focused a lot on one, we had some really interesting connections between the characters because it's sort of about these 2 tribes or these 2 nations, one of which is the TISTE EDUR, and that's where TRULL is, and then the other one is the LETHER or the LETHER, and they're basically kind of on the edge of maybe going to war. We're not sure if they're going to or not, but basically they've had dodgy relations for a while, like things have been going wrong, they've sort of been sneaking off with each other's stuff, and things are kind of on edge when we join this storyline. So we get to see a couple of characters from each side, and I love the way that the 2 storylines from each of the different sides were really interesting and really evenly woven so that we could see the comparison between everything that was going on. And it was quite focused on this one area, so we didn't have the expansive craziness of the whole of the Malazan world and continent as we do in the last few books, but this one being focused on that small sort of those 2 tribes warring or going to war maybe, was really interesting, so I loved that. There were some great new characters that were introduced. There were some really atmospheric and creepy scenes within this. There was some cool magic and godly interference. What more could you want? So, as I said, basically in this book we are following the LETHER and the EDUR. We are following these 2 nations. They're quite different races, and they're basically either on the brink of making a peace treaty or on the brink of going to war. We're not sure when we join the story. The EDUR are a non-human race, and they're very strict about tribe and custom. Each member strives to become blooded, but they're actually very strict in the ways that they do things. They're very ritualized, and they've got a pretty tight-knit community, thanks to the Warlock King, who has basically tried to unite all these EDUR tribes in the last few years, and he's been successful at that. So now they've got a quite substantial force and quite substantial community. They keep slaves from Lether, and they use the slaves to do sort of menial tasks that they don't want to do, such as embalming and things like that. And they have a strong dislike for the Lether because they believe that the Lether have been illegally stealing from them. The LETHERII, on the other hand, are the more prominent sort of human race on the continent of Lether. They've gradually been conquering various different lands over time and forcing their own ways onto the various societies that they have conquered. They're fairly standard in the way that they kind of politic everything, and fighting is definitely a key part of their storyline. But I found that the people that Steven Erikson chose to focus on from the LETHERII side were really interesting, and it definitely made the story interesting because of the people as opposed to the politics or things like that. They were still cool and it still added to the story, but it was certainly the people who really made the story interesting. We don't really know which side we should be rooting for because there's pros and cons to both of them. The EDUR may seem quite tight-knit and nice, but actually they're really nasty to the slaves that they have, and they just have some really weird things that they do, and they're just not nice people on the whole. Whereas the Lether have obviously conquered a lot of races, and they are pretty brutal and nasty too. So both sides are actually quite nasty in their overall values and customs, but there are people within each of the tribes and within each of the races who are really interesting to hear about and learn about. Some of the characters whom I really enjoyed getting to know were, of course, BUGG and TEHOL. My goodness, I loved them. They were so cool. They were a wonderful duo. Steven Erikson is fantastic at creating wonderful duos, and this is definitely another of those wonderful duos that he's fantastic and well known for. It was witty, it was humorous, they had a great relationship, they bounced off of one another, they were even quite silly at times, and it was really great to see that, and they were definitely like a comic relief for me. They're fascinating together, and they react so well to one another. They know kind of instinctually what to say to the other, and it's just really amusing. They were by far my favourite characters, and I had a few moments that I was actually laughing out loud at their stuff that they said. BUGG was a fantastic manservant to TEHOL, but realistically they have a friend relationship as opposed to master and slave or anything like that. TEHOL is a man who's quite bizarre. He's a little bit wacky. He's sort of very highly intelligent, but he's a little bit wacky as well. And he is on the LETHERII side, but he was actually once almost responsible for the collapse of the LETHERII economy, so he's not a loved person. People kind of tend to stay away from him, so he's an interesting one. Then we have TRULL, who is an EDUR, and he is our returning character. He's the one whose backstory we focus on in this story, even though we've already seen him in some of the previous books. So this book is set before some of the other books. Because we've met him before, we do have a little bit of an understanding about his nature and the way that he assesses things and copes with things and does things. But this really was interesting in terms of telling us how he got to that point, because he's actually quite different to some of his race in the way that he thinks about things. He's a very pensive and intelligent character also, and he faces a lot of pressure over the course of this book, which might make another person crack, but he actually copes really well despite a lot of things going wrong and a lot of things that you just could not ever anticipate happening. And I like the fact that towards the later half of the book he was really sort of starting to question the society and the way that they did things, and that was great. Udinast and Featherwitch are really interesting. Featherwitch, I kind of had a love-hate relationship with her because I didn't like her very much because she's a witch who can cast the tiles. The tiles are basically like a really ancient version of the deck of dragons if you've read the other books, and she can cast the tiles, so she's magical. And actually she's quite snooty about that. She's quite stuck up about the fact that she thinks she's kind of better than everyone else. And Udinast is a slave for the EDUR. He's a LETHERII slave, and he feels looked down upon by her. He's in love with her and he wants to be with her at the start of this book, but over the course of the book he definitely goes into some really strange stuff, like things start happening to him and he changes as a person, and he starts to realise that she's a bit of a nasty person, really. It was not a happy-go-lucky nice relationship with them. It was definitely more argumentative and they had a lot more struggles, but the two of them together made for some really interesting thought-provoking conversations, so I liked that. Then we had Shirk and Kettle, and they're both undead. Shirk is an older undead and Kettle is a very young girl who is undead. Both of them were really cool to read about. They each have their own ambitions. Shirk wants to be remade, she wants to become beautiful again because, as you can imagine, being undead is not the most glamorous of lifestyles, so she wishes that she was still mortal and happy. Kettle is very much focused on helping out her friends, and she's got some weird friends. She's got some creepy, weird friends, as you will discover if you read this. They become embroiled in the Lether side of things pretty quickly. And finally we have BRYS. BRYS is the King's Champion on the Lether side. He's actually the brother to TEHOL. His storyline was one of the ones that took me the longest to get into. I didn't connect with him until like the later half of the book for sure. He's fairly stereotypical in that he's sort of a King's Champion, he fights a lot, that sort of thing. But I like the fact that he was a really nice brother to TEHOL and he really cared about his two brothers. And he was always trying to do the best thing for the king, but he also wanted to do the best thing for his family, and he was very loyal, so even though it took me longer to get into his storyline, I still really enjoyed it, and there was a lot of thought-provoking stuff that went on in his story as well. And he was often put in some sort of extreme circumstances, so Definitely really interesting, the three-brother relationship, because there's three of them, and then we also have a three-brother relationship on the EDUR side. So we've got three brothers on the LETHER and three brothers on the TISTE EDUR side, which was a really interesting parallel. I really enjoyed that. There are many more characters that I could mention or go into more detail over, because a lot of them are really interesting, but those were my favourites from the book, and they're the ones who stood out the most to me. In terms of the writing, I feel like Erikson continues to step up, he continues to get better as a writer. This one felt really emotional. There were certainly some scenes where it was really heart-wrenching and sad, but equally there were some moments that were really thought-provoking, really quite compelling and interesting. I have such high hopes for the series now that I'm really invested in it, and he can evoke such vivid moments throughout the book that I really just want to keep reading and keep reading and keep reading. He's brilliant at bringing up thought-provoking topics and things like economy in a really interesting way. I recently read The Dragon's Path, as you guys know, and it was heavily focused on economy, and I really didn't enjoy that. Steven Erikson actually brings up the idea of economy in this world as well, and in this book, and it was so much better done in this book. It was really interesting the way that he approached that topic, so he does it better than someone who focuses their whole book around it. I think that's saying that he's pretty good at what he does. He also brings up slavery and other harsh topics like that, but in a really well-considered way, so generally such a cool book. So there's a lot of brutality, but there's actually a lot of beauty in this story as well. And I am super excited to continue on. I'm actually going to be reading the first one in Esselmont's series next month, which is Knight of Knives, because I've heard that you should read that after reading this one, even though it's by the other author. But I will definitely be getting back to book number 6 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series in July, and I'm 100% so excited to get back into this series, and I'm sure I will continue to love it from now on. So let me know your thoughts if you've read this book, if you've read the series. Whatever you want to say, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all very soon in another video. I gave this 5 stars. It was so good. Bye! Me and you gonna have a little